Hello, my name's John Smeaton, and on behalf of Voice of the Family, I welcome you to the Family and Life Academy and to the second lesson in our course on natural law. The course is written and presented by Dr. Joseph Shaw, a philosopher and author. In his first lesson, Dr. Shaw explored the origins of the natural law tradition in the classical and Roman period, and how in the 4th and early 5th century AD, St. Augustine of Hippo synthesized diverging philosophical traditions with that of Christian revelation, and natural law took shape. This first foundational lesson on the roots of the natural law tradition in the 4th century BC is available for you to watch again whenever suits you best on the Family and Academy website. For his second lesson, Dr. Shaw's subject is eternal law and natural law, and at the end of the lesson, Dr. Shaw will answer any questions you may have about natural law, which you can put in the chat window. And so without further ado, I will now hand over the stage to Dr. Shaw.
Thank you very much, Mr. Smeaton. So this is my second lecture, Eternal Law and Natural Law. And in this presentation and the next one, I'm going to set out the central ideas of St. Thomas Aquinas' theory of natural law. In this one, I will focus on the use Aquinas makes of Aristotle's discussion of natures and dispositions, and how this needed to be supplemented in the light of Christian revelation by bringing in God as a creator of the universe, and on the subject of our final goal, which is heaven. In my last presentation, I explained how St. Augustine of Hippo used the Stoic terminology of natural law to express the idea set out by St. Paul that among the many obligations found in the law codes of the Old Testament, there were eternal moral principles which could never change, alongside mutable rules whose symbolic meaning will be fulfilled in Jesus Christ, and which cease to be binding in the era of the Church. St. Augustine used the term natural law for the first of these, and divine law for the second. One of the first great intellectual developments of the Middle Ages, in its recovery from the collapse of the Roman imperial system, was the development of legal theory. Europe's first university at Bologna, founded in 1088, was a centre for the study of canon law. The canonists rediscovered the legal theorists of Roman times, like Ulpian, and I think we'll get a nice picture of him, and applied their principles and terminology to the law of the Church. They were deeply concerned with the distinction between what, in canon law, could be changed by an appropriate authority, bishop, council, or pope, and what could not. They called this the difference between mutable precepts and immutable ones. The Roman theorists encouraged them in this idea by talking about fundamental principles of law, such as equity, which were not simply willed into being by legislators. The canonists said that immutable principles were a matter of natural law, or equivalently of eternal law. Natural law, after all, is eternal. In the 12th century, St. Thomas Aquinas chose to use these two terms, eternal law and natural law, for two distinct things. In fact, his use of the term natural law varies somewhat between passages, but for the sake of simplicity, I will focus on the way he uses it in a particular passage in what is known as his Treatise on Law in the Summa Theologica. Another important development which influenced Aquinas was the publication in Latin of many texts of Aristotle for the first time. As I noted in the last presentation, Aristotle was not especially influential in the later period of the Roman Empire. His logical work, the Organon, was translated into Latin, and this became the standard textbook on the subject, but none of his other works were available in Latin until Aquinas' own day. Not only that, but scholars with a knowledge of Greek, and come to that, Greek texts for them to read, were very scarce in the West. This meant that Plato's texts, too, were not part of the conversation in the earlier Middle Ages, with small exceptions. But scholars of that era did have access to Latin authors heavily influenced by Plato and Neoplatonism, so his key ideas were not forgotten. Aristotle was not so lucky. The ignorance of Greek in the West in the Middle Ages was a consequence particularly of the difficulty of travel between the Greek-speaking Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, and the West after the disappearance of the Western Roman Empire. The problem became particularly acute following the Islamic conquest of North Africa in the 7th century, when the Mediterranean became dominated by Muslim pirates. Sicily, as well as Spain and North Africa, had come under Islamic control, and slave trading off the coast of Italy, France, and even England became common. The reconquest of Sicily and gradually of Spain by Christian rulers starting in the 11th century created some unique conditions for the works of Islamic scholars to come to the attention of Western Latin intellectuals. In the meantime, a number of Islamic thinkers had become very interested in Aristotle. As a result, scholars of the West started to see Latin translations of Aristotle's works and of the Muslim commentators on Aristotle as well. The work of the Jewish philosopher Maimonides also came to Western attention through this route. At first, translations of Aristotle were sometimes made from Arabic translations, but in time, this was done from the original Greek. The most popular of Aristotle's works turned out to be his Metaphysics, which went on to have an enormous influence on the development of scholasticism. Aquinas' teacher, St. Albert the Great, or Albertus Magnus, was at the forefront of the recovery of Aristotle, and Aquinas himself went on to be a particular champion of Aristotle's ethical treatise and his Politics. Aquinas was not only influenced by Aristotle, but became recognized as a major interpreter of him, writing influential commentaries on Aristotle's major works. Aquinas has the distinction of opposing some peculiar interpretations of Aristotle inspired by Islamic sources, and also recognizing that one particular work attributed to Aristotle, the De Causis, was not genuine. Aquinas made very extensive use of Aristotle's thinking on moral psychology, which is not directly relevant to this series of talks. Aristotle's focus on the virtues, on the importance of moral education, and on the general direction of human nature towards the good, which are so striking to modern readers, did not contrast so much with Aquinas' other sources for the Augustinian tradition, although Aristotle's arguments did clarify many issues. What perhaps made the biggest impact on Aquinas' ethics is an aspect of Aristotle's moral theory, which is connected with his metaphysics, and which I discussed in the last talk. This is Aristotle's theory about each organism, artifact, or thing having a nature which determines its behavior. Plato held a similar view, but for him, a thing's nature is determined by a form, conventionally indicated with a capital F, which exists in a special realm of forms, where numbers and other such abstractions are found. For Aristotle's forms, conventionally in modern English with a small f, are in the things themselves, the concrete particulars. If you're wondering what the Latin for form is, it's forma. Each member of an animal species, or each chair, or each stone, has in it what Aristotle calls a substantial form, a form which makes it the kind of thing it is. Against Plato, Aristotle wrote, "Man begets man. Universal man does nothing." Plato wanted to attribute the causal powers of a concrete individual to the form in which, as he says in his terminology, it participates. Aristotle said that the abstract idea of a man or a dog or a tree doesn't have any role in its day-to-day operations. Their powers of reproduction, for example, are found inside the concrete individual. In the same way, Plato thought that when we know something is a dog, it is because our intellects have come into contact with the abstract form in the realm of forms. Aristotle said that we perceive the form of a dog in the dog, And our intellects turn this realized form, this form which is instantiated in matter as a real live dog, into the abstract idea of a dog. That's something that happens in our minds. The shift of focus between Plato and Aristotle has important implications for science. Essentially, Aristotle told people interested in how things work to look inside the things themselves. One might get the impression from Plato that one should think only about the transcendental form, that one can do science by investigating abstract concepts. Aristotle's approach was universally adopted by medieval philosophers and scientists. Plato's theory represented an alternative way a concept and things which instantiated can be related, which Aquinas did use for certain special cases, for example, the concept of existence. According to Aquinas, eternal law is God's plan of creation for how things are designed to work. Let us first consider the non-rational part of creation, leaving human beings to one side for a moment. God has created a universe filled with substances, and Aquinas understands them in Aristotelian fashion as having within themselves a particular nature determining their behavior. Since God created the universe, he established all these forms and determined how each kind of thing would behave. Thus, stones fall, fire rises, birds look for mates and build nests, and so on, as part of God's creative plan. Eternal law is God's plan for creation and how it is to work, and how God may be said to govern non-rational creation is through the operation of the natures of the things he created. The system of planetary orbits, the tides, the ecosystem, as we call it, are all the result of the complex interplay of individual substances, each trying to fulfill its own nature. Not all succeed, of course. Stones are impeded in moving towards the center of the earth by the obstacles posed by other stones. Birds looking for mates are sometimes caught and eaten by predators, and so on. God's plan for creation is not the perfect flourishing of each individual thing, but each thing striving towards such perfect flourishing. The lion and the lamb it wants for dinner, the rhinoceros and the bacterium which makes it ill, the fire in the volcano and the trees growing on its slopes, which it will burn up, have different goals, but God foresees their interaction both in general terms and in specifics. Modern scientific parlance has a place for laws of nature, but these operate in a somewhat different way. The law of gravity, for example, governs everything insofar as it has weight. The laws of thermodynamics govern everything insofar as they have a temperature. Modern scientists try to describe the universe in terms of the smallest numbers of laws possible and the simplest laws possible. The complexity of real life derives from the complexity of the objects governed, impartially, by these simple laws. In Aristotelian science, by contrast, we might say that each type of thing has its own, rather complex laws. There is a law governing foxes, which is the set of dispositions foxes have. Pine trees have another set, kestrels another, and so on. If God's plan is worked out for non-rational nature by each thing behaving according to the laws intrinsic to its nature, the same is true for rational nature. Humans too have a nature and a goal which we are driven by our nature to seek. The great difference is that rational creatures, humans and angels, are able to apprehend their goal rationally in a way plants, animals, and inanimate objects do not. Even the most sophisticated animal is governed by an instinctive urge towards its goal. As bodily creatures, unlike angels, we humans also have instincts, but we supplement them by a self-conscious understanding of what we are seeking and of the means to it. This is the key to the meaning of Aquinas' puzzling formulation that natural law is the participation by rational creatures in eternal law. If eternal law is God's plan for how the universe should work, the great symphony of things seeking their ends, rational creatures have a special place in this because we can catch a glimpse of what God's grand purpose is, at least in terms of our own natural goals. We can actually understand that we want the things which make for happiness and what those things are. This means that we have a distinct way of participating in eternal law compared with non-rational creation. The behavior of created things derives from their natures, and this can be described in terms of dispositions. At its simplest, tendencies to move in a particular direction, in more complex cases, a disposition and also an ability to perform some task, such as making a nest. These dispositions can be summarized for animals in terms of seeking mates, shelter, food, and safety from predators. The ultimate goal for living non-rational beings, Aristotle says, is to achieve a kind of immortality. Since they cannot evade their own deaths as individuals, they do their best to ensure the continuity of their species. As Aristotle argued, this is the highest perfection possible to them, a limited kind of imitation of God. Non-living things are also goal-directed. We tend not to talk about the behavior of non-living things, but we can talk about their movements. When they get the chance, when they are not impeded, they will move towards that place in the universe where they are at home, so to speak, and so do not need to move any further. Stones and other earthy things have their home as close as possible to the center of the earth. Water takes its place above this, air above the water, one can see bubbles rising to the surface of water when it is released, and fire above the air. The planets have their own place in which they move in circles, so that they can always come back again to where they started, which is a kind of movement which most resembles stasis. This seeking of rest, a situation without change of place, is the way non-living creatures imitate God, who is unchanging. Humans also have natures which give us dispositions, which assist us in seeking the ultimate goal. In the treatise on law, and that's Summa Theologica Prima Secundae, question 94, Aquinas groups them under three headings. He writes, and I quote, "The first is a disposition we share with all substances for self-preservation. The second we share with animals for procreation. The third is specific to us as rational agents to know God and to live in society." End of quotation. The fact that we desire these things, have an inclination to them, reveals them to be desirable, things apt to be the goals of action or goods. It does not mean we are obliged to seek each of them all the time. These goals can, in fact, conflict in concrete situations. A parent might risk his own life to save his children, for example. Nevertheless, they are in themselves good things. If we ask what someone is trying to achieve by some behavior, any of these things could be the basis of a reasonable explanation, if indeed the behavior seems to be a reasonable way to achieve that thing. Thus, if we want to know why someone is digging or running or picking flowers, we would be satisfied with the explanation that he is harvesting potatoes, escaping from a lion, or trying to please a girlfriend. They can all be grouped under a wider heading of reason. As Aquinas puts it, there is in every man a natural inclination to act in accordance with reason, and this is to act in accordance with virtue. That's from Prima Secunda, question 94. It is reason, the intellect, which apprehends what is ultimately worthy of desire, and which presents this to the will as the goal of action. It is reason which sorts out conflicts between the things we are inclined to seek. One might say that for Aquinas and for Aristotle before him, the investigator is given information about the ultimate end of human action by the observable reality of human desires, what people actually want. But this information can be confusing due to the fact that people can misunderstand their own desires and go about fulfilling them in the wrong way. So it needs to be interpreted by reason. The ultimate goal is related to what we all truly desire, which is to say, what we ought to desire. In this way, Aquinas, like Aristotle and Plato, is able to clarify the nature of human happiness rationally. We may be subject to a desire to eat and drink to excess, for example, but this behavior will lead, as Plato points out, to the discomforts of illness and poverty. Thus, even in terms of the pleasure we are seeking from food and drink, a career of self-indulgence is counterproductive and therefore irrational. Aristotle examines the claims of different schools of thought about what happiness consists in, and shows the deficiencies of those which conceive of happiness in terms of pleasure, worldly honours, or worldly goods, and his arguments are taken up by Aquinas. The ultimate good must be something we seek for its own sake, not merely as a means to something else. If it were the means to something else, that other thing would be the ultimate good, or closer to it. So money cannot be the ultimate good, since we seek it for the sake of what it can buy, not for its own sake. The good opinion of others, on the other hand, reflected in our enjoyment of worldly honours, is clearly inferior to the thing that we are supposed to have, which should generate that good opinion, virtue. If it is good that people think we have virtue, it must be even better to have the virtue. If we really value a good reputation, we must value what it is that a good reputation is a good reputation for courage, for example, or justice, friendship, temperance, or virtue in general. It doesn't make sense to say that goods of the body or the opinions of others is the final object of our striving. It also doesn't make sense to suggest that pleasant pastimes are. It would be strange, Aristotle says, if we went to trouble in order to relax. We relax rather in order to restore our energies so that we can return to the task of doing something worthwhile. These are not all knock-down arguments, and Aristotle does not spend much time on them. They are simply ways to clarify our intuitions about what happiness really consists in, which is not a matter of controversy among people who possess a proper moral formation and some experience of life. Aristotle writes, and I quote, "Now each man judges well the thing that he knows, and on these he is a good judge. And so the man who has been educated on a subject is a good judge on that subject, and the man who has received an all-round education is a good judge in general." End of quote. That's from Nicomachean Ethics, Book 1, Chapter 3. Aristotle famously added that, unlike mathematics, moral philosophy was not something which could be taught to the very young. Similarly, he pointed out that to a sick man, everything might taste bitter, but we don't take our descriptions of food from what they taste like to the sick, but what a healthy person thinks of them. The need to have a bit of perspective on life might seem fair enough, but the idea that only a person with the right kind of education is able to see the truth of a position may sound like special pleading or even circularity. But Aristotle is not saying that an Aristotelian training is necessary to appreciate the truth of Aristotelian doctrines. He is making the more fundamental point that one must enter into morality to understand it. One must see morality from the inside. This is reiterated by the characteristic Aristotelian thought that the right thing to do is what a virtuous person would do. If you want to know what courage or justice requires in a given situation, the best person to ask is someone who has courage or justice. This isn't necessarily circular, since the virtuous person may well be easier to identify than the virtuous action. Clearly, the best man to ask about what is the just thing to do is a just man. Gaining the virtue of justice involves not only gaining a disposition to a certain class of actions, it must also involve learning what justice is, and again it must involve the skills needed to do just actions in practice. There is a certain parallel, therefore, between learning the virtue of justice, temperance, friendship, and so on, and learning the words themselves. Many words have a moral aspect, not just virtue terms, but things like equity, need, and honour. And knowing how to use these words appropriately within a certain language community may involve grasping a whole moral attitude or social practice. Different communities will have different moral views, and this will be reflected in how they use such words, and indeed which words they do use. It is not easy to separate completely learning a word and taking on a particular moral viewpoint. Someone who rejects the moral importance of chastity, for example, will be at a disadvantage, at least, in understanding how the word is used when reading literature composed when it was universally understood and valued. Some modern followers of Aristotle have taken this line of thinking to conclude that every language community can also constitute a moral community with its own moral rules. Some of them go on to say that it is not really possible to criticize any of these communities from the outside. All are correct according to their own lights, and that is all that can be said. This makes virtue-based ethics into a form of moral relativism. Aristotle would have rejected this idea because the virtues are aspects of human flourishing, which is to say, the exercise of the human function. The human function is fixed by human nature, and this is universal. If two different communities have different ideas about what it means for human nature to flourish, they can't both be correct. As explained in the last lecture, this idea is incorporated into the Stoic notion of the natural law. Ancient philosophers were well aware that there was disagreement and different ways of life in different places, but Aristotle was dismissive of what non-Greeks thought of the good life, and the Stoics ridiculed the idea that what was right in one place could be wrong in another. Perfectly logically, ancient philosophers believed that what they believed was right, and people who disagreed were wrong. The Christian Aristotelian has another reason for rejecting moral relativism. As noted in the last presentation, St. Paul thought that the most fundamental principles of morality, which may be called the law, were written upon the hearts of all men, even of the pagan Romans. He is concerned to emphasize that the Romans bear moral responsibility for their idolatry, and that God's punishment of them is accordingly just. Aristotle, by contrast, thinks that profound moral ignorance is perfectly possible, but that this is not an excuse. A man who thinks that the ultimate end of human life is a bad man. The importance of objective human nature in ethics will come up again in the final lectures of this series. Aristotle's official definition of happiness, the well-lived life, is a complete life of unimpeded virtuous activity. Having given this definition, he goes on to describe the individual virtues. The life must be complete in the sense that it is not lacking anything that could make it better. And the exercise of virtue must be unimpeded in the sense that the happy man must have the freedom and resources to exercise the virtues. With both of these qualifications, Aristotle incorporated good fortune into the notion of happiness. We can be virtuous and unfortunate, like Priam, the king of Troy, whose city was burnt and whose sons were killed before being killed himself. That is not anyone's idea of the ideal life, and looking at the wretched king's life as a whole, we would not call him happy. Aquinas could not simply incorporate Aristotle's account of the good life into his own theory for more than one reason. The most obvious is that it makes no reference to the salvation of the soul, since Aristotle had no notion of this. Unlike Plato, he did not hold out the prospect of post-mortem reward and punishment or reincarnation. He gives some hints that the soul might survive death, but does not develop this idea. It is difficult, in fact, to see what the soul could do after death on Aristotle's theory of the soul, as he holds that the soul is dependent on the senses for the mental images it needs to do any thinking. Aquinas, in fact, solved that problem by invoking divine assistance. God himself would supply the necessary images until we get our bodies back at the resurrection of the dead. At the end of his greatest moral work, the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle offers readers an alternative view of the happy life, modelled more closely on the imitation of the life he attributes to God. Talking in monotheistic terms, elsewhere Aristotle gives an elaborate argument for a single deity as an unmoved mover of the universe. Aristotle argues that the supreme being would not change or suffer and would engage only in the activity which implies the least possible change, the contemplation of the highest eternal objects, above all himself. Although we humans will have to break off to sleep and eat and so on, we can engage in this philosophical activity ourselves, which will be the most divine kind of life we can achieve. This speculation is of little interest to Aquinas, since although it is focused on God both as a model to imitate and as subject for meditation, it does not involve the action of divine grace, God's assistance to us, which makes us capable of enjoying the happiness of eternal union with God in the beatific vision. Aristotle's life of philosophical contemplation is a life of purely natural virtue. It cannot surmount the problem of original sin to restore our friendship with God. Aquinas regarded this limitation of Aristotle's as quite natural, since Aristotle had not enjoyed the benefit of divine revelation. There was no way for him to know that a higher destiny for men, higher than the exercise of natural virtue, was possible, nor was Aristotle aware of original sin. In this way, Aristotle and his work has a particular value for Aquinas, as they exemplify what it is possible for someone to know without the benefit of revelation or grace. Aristotle was able to see that God exists. Aristotle was able to see the superiority of a life of self-restraint and benevolence over one of self-indulgence and cruelty. Aristotle was able to see that the soul or mind is the noblest part of man, is enriched by virtues and disfigured by vices, and that it could even survive death. He was able to see the importance of the cardinal virtues, prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. And Aquinas was not embarrassed to help himself to these insights, the achievements of human reasoning, which did not contradict the information forthcoming from revelation. In some ways, of course, Aristotle had to be corrected, and is sometimes at fault. He took slavery and infanticide for granted, for example, and he should have known better. Again, he thought the world was not created, but eternal, whereas Aquinas' understanding of Scripture indicated that it had a beginning in time. In this case, Aquinas suggested that unaided human reason could not rule out the possibility of the world going back infinitely into the past, and that revelation has given us new information from a different source. This is an illustration of Aquinas' distinction between what we know by reason and what we know by faith, which is equivalent to the distinction between philosophy, which encompasses science, and theology. Reason and faith should not be thought of as different methods of coming to knowledge, but as different sources of information, the book of nature and the book of revelation, as they are sometimes called. Both must be examined using all our powers of rational inquiry, and the certain conclusions of each must be accepted as facts. In the case of what is given us in revelation, however, the virtue of faith is granted to us to hold these facts with complete certainty, since the essential facts of revelation are necessary to salvation. On the other hand, the methods of human reasoning developed by philosophy are so important to a competent handling of revelation that philosophy should be regarded as a prologue to theology, not the other way round. Aquinas follows this principle himself. He starts his great work, the Summa Theologica, with arguments for the existence of God, drawn not from revelation, but from the observable facts of the natural world. These arguments continue a tradition established by Aristotle and Plato. In dealing with happiness, the goal of action, Aquinas first considers what human reason can establish, which he regards as corresponding to what human effort can attain. By reason, we can see that the best life for a human being is a life of virtuous activity. And it is this life which, while difficult, is at least theoretically possible for humans who lack the assistance of God's grace, by contrast with a life of supernatural virtue which culminates in union with God. It is not just that pagans had no notion that God planned such a possibility for us, but that insofar as they might have considered such a thing, they would quite correctly have concluded that it was completely out of their grasp. We can go even further, in fact, and say that the beatific vision as the end of life is something for which human nature is not fitted, to which it does not naturally aspire. Our supernatural destiny, as Aquinas puts it, is something not concordant with human nature. In raising us to this, God is raising us above our own natures. This is an illustration of another distinction very characteristic of Aquinas between the natural and the supernatural. This raises the question of whether, when Aquinas talks about nature, he is talking about nature in a fallen state or nature in an unfallen state, whether this takes into account original sin. Original sin creates a problem for the distinction between philosophy and theology, because a philosophical treatment of human nature which did not take account of it would be flawed, and indeed many modern philosophical accounts of human nature are flawed for precisely this reason. On the other hand, a realistic pagan philosopher can understand the problematic nature of the human condition, even if he can't put his finger on what exactly has gone wrong. As far as Aquinas' distinction between natural and supernatural happiness goes, it is fallen nature he has in mind, since it was a fallen nature which was the subject of investigation by Aristotle and Plato before him, whether they realized this or not. In a similar way, the legal theorists of the century before Aquinas had invented the idea of a state of nature before the establishment of the state, an idea taken up without acknowledgement by Thomas Hobbes centuries later. Like Hobbes, they asked what people, unconstrained by obligations to a state, would be happy to give up in order to benefit from the advantages political institutions bring, though they came to very different conclusions from Hobbes. These theorists' questions take for granted the difficulties caused by sin, which can be ameliorated by the state's promotion of law and order. Human nature before the fall, in fact, was not simply nature. Like human nature after redemption, it is nature crowned by grace. Adam and Eve were given all sorts of graces when they were in the state of original innocence. When they fell from a state of grace into a state of nature not raised to a higher dignity by grace, as well as falling from a pristine state of nature into a state of wounded nature, a state in which our passions are subject to sinful desires, concupiscence, our intellects are darkened, and our wills are weakened. This state of nature under original sin is still worthy of study, and as I have set out, is still capable of virtue and of recognizing important truths such as the existence of God. Aquinas differs from Aristotle then in offering his readers two accounts of happiness: human, natural, or imperfect happiness, and, on the other hand, perfect or supernatural happiness. These should not be confused with the happiness of this world and the happiness of the next, since we can begin to enjoy supernatural happiness in the present life. The life of grace, made possible by baptism and the other sacraments, gives us a foretaste of the happiness we will enjoy in its fullness, God willing, in heaven. Related to this is another contrast between Aristotle's conception of happiness and that found in Aquinas and in the Christian tradition in general. Because Aristotle believed that happiness required resources, leisure, and a degree of personal freedom, he did not think that it was available to most people. People living under tyrannies, including the subjects of the Persian Empire of his own day, did not have the share in government which allowed Athenian citizens to regard themselves as self-governing. Even in Athens, women, children, slaves, and free non-citizens, notably resident foreigners, including Aristotle himself, were in the same position. Compared to later schools of thought like the Stoics, Aristotle was being very open-minded in thinking happiness could be attained by a significant number of people, at least in a democratic city like Athens. Modern readers, however, tend to be shocked by how few they were. One might defend Aristotle by saying that, given the material privation and political oppression found in the world of the 4th century before Christ, he was simply being realistic. However, part of the problem is that his conception of happiness is highly specific. He thinks the best kind of life is that of an Athenian gentleman. If this is so, any other kind of life could be improved and therefore can't be described as the ultimate goal of human action. Modern readers tend to think that, even if extreme misfortunes may make happiness impossible, a wide range of circumstances allows it. The mix of virtues needed for different ways of life and social roles will be different, of course, and we may want to rank ways of life to some extent. But we want to hang on to the idea that just because one lives in a poorly functioning political system, or one does not have enough money for leisurely cultural pursuits, or is not educated in a way Aristotle would recognize, one can still be happy. Indeed, it is possible to be happy in really quite adverse circumstances. The idea that different ways of life with different configurations of the virtues can be ideal in a sense for different people is something modern secular culture owes to Christianity. Aristotle thought of happy people as the people who are living the best possible life. St. Paul, by contrast, teaches the very varied people of the nascent Christian churches to be content with their lot in life, with their functions in the community, and with the graces they have received. By all means, he says, seek after the higher graces. But even while acknowledging a hierarchy of grace and function within a community, he points out that each function is essential to the good of the whole. The salvation of each member depends on his or her fulfillment of this function. Well, cheerfully, conscientiously, without envy or factionalism. Again, every member of the community, without exception, is called to sanctity and to the life of heaven. If, as St. Paul affirms, there is a hierarchy in heaven, as there is on earth, there is no reason to think that the two will correspond in membership. Apostles can be lost entirely, slaves can attain the glory of martyrdom. This might be explained by the moralization of the concept of happiness. Whereas Aristotle tried to describe what happiness required in natural terms, a Christian conception of happiness focused on one's relationship with God makes one's external circumstances less important. However, this is not the whole story. The Christian attitude gives dignity to the humbler ways of life because they can be considered as being what God has assigned to us. The virtues necessary for the specific circumstances in which we find ourselves are, in this sense, the virtues we are called to cultivate. Exercising those virtues as well as possible is, in a sense, the form perfection takes for us. St. Paul's attitude, which is also that of the Gospels and indeed of the Old Testament, has been deeply influential on Christian culture. We venerate saints from every age for the church, in whom, in St. Paul's phrase, God's power is made perfect in weakness, the poor, the sick, the despised, and downtrodden But this is not some kind of inverted snobbery. We also have saints who are highly educated or who exercise the supreme offices of church and state. The virtues of St. Henry the Emperor were quite distinct from those of St. Isidore the Farmer, but in both natural and in supernatural terms we may say that they exercised the virtues proper to their states of life. In this way, both virtue and happiness is relativized to one's calling. In this talk, I have set out how Aristotle, newly translated into Latin, influenced Aquinas in his understanding of natural law. Natural law might be called the law of human nature, our special way as rational beings of fulfilling God's plan of creation. We are to do this in Aristotelian fashion through the virtues. And the next lecture, I will explain how this virtue-focused approach is combined with an appreciation of the importance of moral rules.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Shaw. So we have, I'm happy to say, a number of questions. And we'll start with this one. Did the strange interpretations of Aristotle, influenced by Islamic sources, lead to Aristotle being condemned at one point in the 13th century?
Well, there was a controversy about Aristotle, and the Bishop of Paris, they weren't archbishops until amazingly late, and the Bishop of Paris condemned a series of propositions in, I think, 1270. Exactly what the content of those propositions were is actually slightly more complicated than one would like, and so exactly what he condemned is a matter of historical debate. But there does seem to have been an animus against Aristotle at that time, and a bit later as well. But that was a relatively brief blip in Aristotle's influence in the West. And was this about the Islamic interpretations? Well, yes. I should qualify that it's not the philosophers who, well, notably Averroes, who came up with a particular interpretation. He was certainly a Muslim, but there's nothing very Islamic about his particular his theories. So here he is. He has a kind of cameo position in the in Raphael's School of Athens, because he was he was regarded with great respect, and also the relationship between what became known as the Latin Averroists and Averroes' own views is far too complicated to tackle here. But most famously, the Latin Averroists were monopsychists, which means that they thought there was only one mind, that we all shared in one mind. A very, very peculiar idea, just as strange as it sounds. And Aquinas was a key person in not only refuting this as a philosophical position, but showing that Aristotle himself was not, didn't hold that view.
Thank you. Thank you. So, right, second question. How does the Franciscan school differ from Aquinas in relation to Aristotle's influence?
Yeah, well, the Franciscan school, quote unquote, is itself a somewhat controversial topic. It's not in a straightforward way. There isn't a kind of hierarchy or a kind of relationship of teacher and pupil between Bonaventure, Scotus, and Occam, who are the three great, most well-known Franciscan writers. So they're not related to each other in a kind of obvious kind of way. So we have to be cautious about talking about the Franciscan school. However, it's true that Aquinas and his Dominican followers were the great champions of Aristotle, and indeed Aquinas' predecessor, well, not predecessor, his teacher, Albert the Great, who in fact wasn't his predecessor, he predeceased his own teacher. So Albert the Great had a rather long life, Aquinas had a rather short one. But in any case, yeah, they were the great champions of Aristotle. The Franciscans, not so much. The Augustinians, even less. So it's from the Augustinian stable, of course, eventually Luther appears with a hatred of scholasticism in general and Aristotelianism in particular. The Franciscans, of course, they were scholastics. We still describe them as scholastics, and their work was certainly Scotus's and Occam's is very much downstream of Aristotelian influence. And they were taking things in different directions, but they kind of took on board the kind of the Aristotelian metaphysics, and they were working in that tradition. Not as closely, not hewing as closely to Aristotelian orthodoxy, you might say. Yeah, anyways, that gives some indication of an answer.
Thank you. Thank you. So I've got another question here. Does the popular modern conception of science and faith as being opposed to each other stem from the Protestant rejection of reason in theology, or from a modern scientific rejection of faith in understanding the visible world?
Thanks. Yeah, so I think that the key thing here is Protestantism. So Luther, more so than Calvin, in fact, but Luther says faith and reason are completely distinct, and if you try to get to God by reason, and this is something that Lutheran theologians still sometimes say, if you try to get to God through reason, then you don't get to God, you get to an idol of your own creation, which is a bit scary. We end up being idolaters. So there's a kind of complete rejection of reason, and reason really is no good at all. So one of the results of this is a separation of theology from philosophy and from science. So because they have a very negative view of science, scientists who do appear, and indeed philosophers who do appear in societies of Protestant culture, tend to be people who are not of the kind of religious milieu. So they are not also theologians, for example. So there's a kind of, it's as if religion rejects reason first, and then you create a kind of culture of science and philosophy, which is anti-religious, almost because it has to be, because they've been rejected. So that's a real problem. Now, the scientific revolution was done by people who were in that Protestant world, who regarded religion as something which had nothing to do with them, because religion had closed its doors to them. And yeah, they just don't have anything to do with religion. And in fact, I mean that's a huge sort of simplification, because you get people like Newton, who actually is a kind of religious maniac in his non-scientific writings. He's got extraordinary views, which he takes terribly seriously, and kind of fills up massive volumes, going on and on about them. But it's completely crazy. I mean, it's not mainstream Protestantism, or even mainstream Christianity. It's just some stuff that he's made up himself. But nevertheless, as a society, there is this distinction is very strongly made, but it's made first by theologians, not by scientists. And that this doesn't happen in Catholic societies in the same way, at least not for not in that period, not until much later.
Thank you. Well, I think we've got time for one more, at least. because I've got a couple more questions here, but anyway, we'll do what we can. Is there a possibility of a synthesis between Aristotelian science and modern science, which would take into consideration not only strictly material things, but also the good or goal of created things?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question, and I'm going to come in a little bit more to this question later on. I'm going to address in a later lecture what happened to Aristotelianism, why it was rejected, and the role that Protestantism, scientific revolution, and other developments had in that. So my kind of analytic philosophy colleagues do sometimes say, well, why, is it really so distinct? Isn't this simply a different way of expressing the scientific worldview, a different model, not necessarily incompatible? There is a problem, though, in the Aristotelian idea that things have goals, which is that you're attributing a certain kind of intentionality, even to stones, let alone, okay, animals you might think, or plants, certainly human beings, but stones, they have an intentionality. So Aristotle at one point says that a heavy stone will fall because that's what it wants to do, so to speak. So the phrase "so to speak," I don't know what it is in Greek, but "so to speak" is doing a lot of work there. So he wants, on the one hand, he wants to say, well, stones want to fall because that is their goal, it's their end, it's their purpose, as it were. But on the other hand, because they don't think. Stones don't think. I mean, no matter what you think about animals, stones definitely don't think. So it's very odd. It's a very odd thing to say. And actually, that's important. I mean, that's important for Aristotle, because for him, there's an analogy between the way stones behave, the way plants behave, the way animals behave, the way humans behave. He's building up through these different things, and humans are really a special case of substances in general, which have objects, which have goals. So how can you explain that in modern scientific terms? That's a problem, but I won't say more because we'll run over our allotted time.
Okay, so we'll move to a more exalted level. Here with our last question: is there a higher natural law which corresponds to the higher nature and goals of angels? If so, does St. Thomas deduce anything about it?
Well, angels certainly have natures, and those natures certainly have implications for their functions, their role, what they can do, what they should be doing, and that's that principle. That's clear. So the answer to the question, I suppose, is yes. But our knowledge of angels, of course, is pretty pretty sparse. So Aquinas doesn't say very much about it, because there isn't very much information to be had. In fact, there's a story, and a kind of whimsical story, about Aquinas having a vision of his sister who died. And he says to her, "Tell me about the mode of knowledge of the angelic orders," because that's what I want to know. Never mind about anything else. Because it was a problem for Aristotle how angels perceived not having sense organs. I mean, he didn't doubt it. It's just that he would like to know how it happened. How did it work? But that information, like so many things, has not been granted to us by divine revelation, and there's no way for us to get the information any other way. Angels are not subjects of scientific investigation, really. So we have to leave a lot of this a bit vague, I'm afraid.